Hello and welcome to a new type of episode of Bright on Buddhism. In this series, I will be presenting and discussing some of my own original research, which covers a broad range of topics in Japanese Buddhism, and discussing it in the context of East Asian Buddhism and other disciplines broadly. Today's project is my East Asian Languages and Cultures Master's Thesis project. This project was called 20th Century Philosophy and Ecology in the World of Living Things by Imanishi Kinji, and it centered around one particular text called Seibutsu no Sekai in Japanese, or The World of Living Things in English. This text was authored by Imanishi Kinji, who is often regarded as Japan's first ecologist, as well as the father of Japanese primatology, the study of monkeys. Imanishi was a highly influential figure in the early 20th century and beyond due to his syncretic and interdisciplinary academic engagement with the Western Academy, his vibrant scholarly career, and his passion for the study of living things. His work, The World of Living Things, was one of his most influential works, and it gained a wide readership because of its accessible writing style, but also because of one massively important point. It presented a prototype for one of the earliest and most compelling theories of evolution that was not based at all on natural selection by means of competition for resources. Instead, it contained a theory of evolution which relied on a specific type of coexistence, which relied on the function of a concept called seimei, which is a very complicated term referring to the non-material component of life and living things. This Japanese term has a complicated and rich life in the works of Kyoto school Buddhist philosophers, especially those of Nishida Kitaro, the founder of the Kyoto school. It also has a very distinctive life in the works of Imanishi Kinji. To that end, The World of Living Things represents a commentary on Western ecology and natural history. In this study, I argue that while Imanishi is in fact in dialogue with Western ecologists and philosophers like Jan Smuts, and Japanese philosophers such as Nishida Kitaro, a close reading and analysis of their texts alongside The World of Living Things highlights some significant distinctions between Imanishi's positions and theirs. Namely, Imanishi, though he does inherit some of the aspects of Jan Smuts' philosophy, which is known as holism, he's definitely not a holist, and he differs importantly on how one ought to understand systems of living things. Additionally, while Nishida emphasizes the non-material aspect of life by means of the concept of life energy, or seimei, Imanishi emphasizes its contextuality and emergence within the environment as an organizational principle of organisms and the societies that they live in. This is made clear in his presentation of three main ideas in the world of living things, which are a monistic view of reality, a non-materialistic view of the nature of life and living things, and a perspective of ecology that does not rely on Darwinian competition for resources and survival of the fittest. I hope you enjoy. This is an incredibly complicated topic, so a little background information to make all of this make sense is probably due here. We will start with a brief discussion of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, with some attention given to its life in Japan in the early 20th century. Then, we will proceed to a discussion of developments in Japanese culture and history in the 1930s, with special attention given to developments in Buddhism and in science. Then, we will proceed with a discussion of the life of Imanishi Kinji himself. Finally, we will finish with a discussion of his 1941 work, The World of Living Things, and what his non-competitive theory of evolution actually looks like. Starting with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, we should mention the theory and its assumptions, its influences, and its legacy, particularly in Japan. Darwin's theory of evolution is laid out in his masterwork, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, which was published on November 24, 1859. This theory proposed that populations change over geological time by means of a process of natural selection. The assumption was that each individual in a species had what is called differential reproductive success. That means that if that organism has 10 offspring, a certain number of them, say 3 of them, will die due to bad luck, either through natural disaster or disease, or they will die due to a lack of fitness. This fitness is defined by the ability of that individual to survive in its environment long enough to reach reproductive age and to pass on its genetic material, which is heritable, and therefore can be passed on to the organism's offspring. This natural selection, then, was this culling process where 3 of the 10 offspring pass away. The individuals who were not fit to survive in their environment were killed off before they reached reproductive age and thus could not pass on their genetic material. Thus, the less fit traits in a species were eventually stamped out and the more fit traits were favored. Naturally, it is well known that the environment changes over time. There's a fire, and maybe there is no longer a forest where there once was. Or maybe there is a landslide and the topography of a space changes. These changes in the environment thus change what traits are most fit for that given environment. That being the case, the most favorable traits in a population change over a large period of time, resulting in physiological changes in a species that can be observed and measured according to the fossil record. When these changes in environment, and then subsequently in physiology, occur, sometimes the result can be that one group of individuals can no longer reproduce with others that they previously could reproduce with, either due to physiology that doesn't match up, due to a geographical barrier, or due to the offspring being unable to reproduce or survive on their own. This is the process of speciation, and is the cause for the biodiversity we see around us today. Thus, humans and primates, for example, share a common ancestor organism that very likely looked more like a primate than we do now, but due to a change in environment, one subgroup of the total population of that organism underwent physiological change that made it so that they could not reproduce with the rest of the group. Those changes resulted in the creation of a new species, Homo sapiens. The old species, however, did not go away. Because of that, we have humans and primates that exist on Earth at the same time, but we look very different and are no longer part of the same species, and thus can't reproduce with each other. This theory of evolution was rather revolutionary in ways that I won't get too far into at this time, but suffice to say that it becomes a landmark in the field of not only biology, but also sociology, anthropology, and economics. The reason why the theory was so influential in so many different disciplines is that these three fields were not nearly as distinct and separate as we think of them today. Because of that, interpretations and misinterpretations of Darwin's theory and challenges to it abounded in the early years after its publication. Up to that point, biology as we understand it today simply did not exist as a field of study. Biology is now regarded as a hard science which relies strongly on the scientific method, but it was not always that way. It stems from a field which is now called natural philosophy or natural history, a field which does not always rely on experimentation to make claims about the causes of phenomena in the world. This field was born during the European Age of Enlightenment, and in the time of Darwin, it was beginning to differentiate into something a lot closer to the field of biology as we understand it today. But it did not do so quietly. Nearly everybody in the West had something they wanted to say about Darwin's theory. Many religious groups and some academics squarely rejected the theory at its face. The academy in the West in general grappled with the meaning and the implications of the theory, and Western sociologists appropriated it for extremely nefarious racial theories, and imperial powers in Europe used it to justify their actions that they did upon the peoples inhabiting their colonies. Thus, it went on to have its very own interpretive life outside of what we now call the field of evolutionary biology. A big reason for the complicated interpretive life of the theory of evolution in the early years after its publication is the fact that it came about almost a century before the discovery of the DNA molecule, and even further back from the technology required to engage in genetic sequencing. This meant that the mechanisms of inheritance of genetic material and the methods for measuring the frequency of the presence of certain genes in a population were totally non-existent. However, obvious physiological differences between organisms were readily observable. Think of Darwin's finches, for example. The differences in the shape and size of their beaks was blatantly obvious to scientists, but they could only speculate as to specifically how those differences emerged. Therefore, in the late 19th century, ecologists and natural philosophers and anthropologists and sociologists decided to read their own grand theories of everything into the empty space, attempting to capture differences in organisms in their larger theories of how the world worked. One of the scholars I mentioned before, Jan Smuts, provided his view on the theory of evolution in his works concerning what we now call Smutsian holism. Smutsian holism is the view that ecological systems, namely populations and their environments, ought to be viewed and studied as internally coherent, ever-functioning wholes. That's whole with a WH. This holistic view, he argues, suggests the presence of a non-material component to living things. In fact, we can attribute the function, the organization, and the nature of the holistic system to this non-material component of life. This component is the force which causes organisms to do just what is in their name, organize. How else would the common ancestor of Darwin's finches know to produce different sized and different shaped beaks that were optimized for the different sources of food that were available to them, and then subsequently speciate into the many varieties of finches that we see today? According to Smuts, it is this non-material force, and not natural selection, that primarily drives these changes. though natural selection still plays a part. This was Jan Smuts's attempt to marry the materialistic Western Science Academy to the non-materialistic Humanities/Religion Academy. This is because many of the people who rejected Darwin's theory of evolution at its face rejected it because they thought that it relied on a materialistic understanding of the world. That is to say, it relied on an interpretation of nature which did not have any room for God, for souls, or for any non-material component whatsoever. However, Jan Smuts intended to see if he could find a way to reconcile these two conflicting views about the world. Fast forward to when Darwin's theory of evolution arrived in Japan in 1877, when Edward Morse introduced it to an audience of university students at a lecture at the University of Tokyo. The theory was received in a large variety of different ways by different groups and for different reasons. And for more on this, I highly recommend reading Gerard Clinton Goddard's book called Darwin, Dharma, and the Divine: Evolutionary Theory and Religion in Modern Japan. This book traces the life of the theory of evolution among religious institutions in Japan, such as Buddhist temples, Shinto affiliations, as well as in academic and political institutions. In the book, he also discusses that the theory of evolution did not arrive in Japan in one piece. The entire debate that I alluded to earlier in Japan arrived piecemeal. Imagine receiving a copy of a movie script, but each character's lines are given to you separately, and then it is up to you to figure out the plot of the movie and make the order of the lines make sense. This is a useful analogy for thinking about how Japanese people had to make sense of the debates going on in the West about how to interpret the theory of evolution I was mentioning earlier. They were brought into a room in the middle of a loud and crowded and lively debate, and they had to make sense of what was going on all at one time and what everybody was saying. This was a super complicated process, which is documented extremely well in Goddard's book, and so I won't go too far into it, except to jump ahead to the early 20th century to discuss the intellectual context for Imanishi and his work, The World of Living Things. To contextualize us historically, we should talk about Imanishi's dates and when he was most active. Imanishi Kinji lived from 1902 to 1992. His life and his career spanned across 4 eras of Japanese history, namely the Meiji era, which lasted from 1868 until 1912, the Taisho era, which lasted from 1912 to 1926, the Showa era, which lasted from 1926 to 1989, and the Heisei era, which lasted from 1989 to 2019. These periods were marked by several generations worth of change and advancement in culture, society, science, and technology, all happening in a very short amount of time. Just think about how in the West, around the time of Imanishi's birth, the Wright brothers flew their very first manned aircraft in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, and then by the time that he died in 1992, the United States had sent 12 different astronauts to the moon on 7 different manned Apollo missions. This is a massive amount of change and advancement in such a short amount of time. That being the case, to sufficiently discuss the trends in world scholarship throughout and on either side of Imanishi's life would be difficult, nigh impossible. However, there are some considerable trends of thinking in academia, both inside and outside of Japan, which serve as significant influences on Imanishi's own thinking and provide one of the contexts for the world of living things. The trends that I choose to discuss for my project existed in 3 primary disciplines of academia, which, though interconnected through the work of Japanese scholars, including Imanishi himself, can be thought of separately and independently as ecology, philosophy, and religion. The world of living things and its stances in these 3 domains of knowledge serve as the primary focus for this study, and what Imanishi read and studied and responded to in these domains of knowledge production serve as the context for it. In the 1920s through the 1940s, inside and outside of Japan, the field of ecology can be said to have still been working to bear out the implications of Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection. As an early 20th century scholar in Japan, to engage with the theory of evolution was an attempt to reconcile or take positions on several disparate agendas and ideologies that existed in Japan at the time, including but not limited to those of institutions of Buddhism, those of Shinto, Christianity, Japanese imperialism, materialism, anti-materialism, rationalism, socialism, nationalism, modernism, and militarism. The narratives of these agendas and ideologies, though too numerous to discuss adequately in this study, are nonetheless all immediately relevant to the reception of evolutionary theory in Japan, and that's discussed in great detail in Goddard's book. The debates in ecology that are the primary focus of this study, and which Imanishi directly responds to in The World of Living Things, are debates about materialism versus anti-materialism, competition versus coexistence, and optimistic utopism versus pessimistic survivalism. These are all different modes for understanding the meaning and the implication of Darwin's theory of evolution. For example, you could argue that it assumes that the world is entirely materialistic and there is not anything in it which cannot be sensed by one of the five senses, meaning there is no God, no soul, and no other immaterial component of life. The other side of that argument is the interpretation of evolution which is anti-materialistic. That is to say that evolution happens over large amounts of time, but it occurs as the result of a function of some non-materialistic component, such as a god who is engaging in intelligent design and is guiding us along this path of evolution. Or maybe it's a soul or some other organizational principle which cannot be measured by the senses, which is making all of this change happen. Another interpretation of the theory is that the world is made up of relationships of competition. This interpretation holds that the most fit organism, the one that survives to pass on its genetic material, is the one that is the best at sequestering and hoarding all of the resources for itself and outcompeting all of the other organisms around it. The opposite interpretation of that is the interpretation of coexistence, which argues that the fitness of an organism is a measure of how able it is to actually coexist in harmony with the other organisms around it, and how able they are to circulate and share resources effectively without depleting them, and also without giving too many to one organism. On the other side, there's also an interpretation that this theory of evolution imposes an optimistic, utopic idea for how the world will eventually be. That is, there are people that think that the theory of evolution argues that all organisms, humans included, will eventually evolve to the point where we have a utopic society that coexists perfectly and has no crime, has no necessity, and has no lack of resources. And then the opposite interpretation from that is pessimistic survivalism. That represents the interpretation that the world is extremely survivalistic and nothing more, and will never eventually change towards a positive utopic society, but will always be this dog-eat-dog world, where the only way to survive is to defeat or win out against other organisms. All of these interpretations circulated and were hotly debated around the time of Imanishi's life. Early in Imanishi's career in the 1920s, which marked the transition between the Taisho and Showa eras of Japanese history, the Kyoto School of Philosophy and its founding father, Nishida Kitaro, were a profound influence on Japanese academia and how they engaged with all of these different interpretations of the theory of evolution. The work of the numerous Kyoto School scholars is entirely too varied and detailed to discuss here, but special attention should be given to the work of Nishida Kitaro, with whom Imanishi and his collaborators had a personal relationship, and whose works Imanishi at times quoted, paraphrased, or responded to in his own writings, including The World of Living Things. The concern of a large portion of Imanishi's work was to establish that the primacy of pure experience precedes the split of subject and object, and that empiricism and religious intuition arise as a result of differentiation from that experience. Some scholars argue that this pure experience, being the universal source of different ways of knowing, as he says it is, marks Nishida's view of reality as being inherently monist in nature, and that serves as a considerable influence on Imanishi's The World of Living Things. This was borne out in Imanishi's writing in very specific detail. Additionally, another idea that Nishida and Imanishi share is a critical perspective on the concepts of subjectivity and objectivity. Nishida argues that subjectivity and objectivity are but two profiles of the same phenomenon, and that they arise as a result of differentiation from this pure experience, which precedes the subject-object split. Thus, the tendency for Western science to aim for maximizing objectivity over subjectivity, especially in the study of human beings, is misguided and leads to an incomplete understanding of the nature of phenomena. These different perspectives in Nishida's philosophy are widely held to be influenced by Japanese Buddhism, and thus mark an indirect Buddhist influence from Nishida's work onto Imanishi's work, The World of Living Things. When we say Buddhism in the context of Nishida, or in the context of 20th century Japan in general, we are tripping over the tip of an iceberg of complex history and discourse, and we would be missing a vital piece of the puzzle in this project if we didn't discuss it. The 19th and 20th centuries are often understood as the period when Japan made the transition from pre-modern to modern. This is a loaded and problematic way of talking about people and places and time, but it's an interpretation that's out there, and we need to understand it. The transition from pre-modern to modern for Japanese Buddhism is marked by the persecution of Buddhism in the Meiji era, which, as you remember, lasted from 1868 to 1912. In a social and political movement known as Haibutsu Kishaku, which roughly translates to Abolish Buddhism, Destroy the Buddha. This movement was the culmination of nativist trends in religion that found their roots much earlier in the past. Prior to this Meiji era, during the Tokugawa era, which lasted from 1600 to 1868, there was a large resurgence in nativist studies, which emphasized Shinto as the native and indigenous religion of Japan and critiqued continental systems like Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism, which had come from China. This movement gained increasing popularity that lasted well into the Meiji era, and in some ways caused the Meiji Restoration, which marked the transition from the Tokugawa to the Meiji periods. In that regard, Buddhism had lost a great deal of credibility and popularity within Japanese society as a result of cultural and academic trends shifting towards this nativist ideology. Additionally, there was an increasing concern with modernity, rationality, secularity, and other Western ideals and values that gained increasing popularity in Japan's society in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Consequently, as the Meiji government dictated and promulgated the state Shinto narrative, which held that the emperor was a descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, and thus was a holy living god, as well as the discourse of modernity and rationality, several anti-Buddhist government policies and social movements came about to advance that process. One such policy was that of separating Buddhism and Shinto. This policy was known as Shinbutsu Bunri. This policy required every Buddhist and Shinto shrine temple complex to separate their clergy, their ritual activities, their sectarian affiliation, and their neighborhood roles. It goes without saying that because of the history of religion in Japan, this was largely an impossible and futile task. Buddhism and Shinto have always been very, very closely related in Japanese history and religion. This policy then functioned more as a warning shot against Buddhist institutions to show them that they were losing influence with the government. This policy inflamed a lot of Japanese nativists against Buddhism and led to a strong anti-Buddhist social movement that critiqued Buddhism on the grounds of it being a foreign, anachronistic, and obsolete ideology, and carried out a widespread persecution of Buddhist institutions. These changes within the Japanese government and in society at large led Buddhist institutions and thinkers to reinvent and justify themselves and their institutions within a rapidly changing Meiji Japanese society. These changes included the creation of many trans-sectarian organizations, which bridge the gap between Pure Land and Zen and esoteric and so on and so forth. And it also led to the emergence of several new religious movements, some of which can be still found today, such as Soka Gakkai and Tenrikyo. We can also observe the co-opting of Buddhist discourse into a new and budding kind of Japanese academia, which is trying to emulate and model that of the Western Academy. This is done primarily by figures like Inoue Enryo and the Kyoto school philosophers like Nishida Kitaro. To that end, it can be said that discourse on Buddhist doctrines and on different sectarian beliefs and on the meaning and significance of different rituals carried on outside of the traditional ecumenical structure of Buddhism and inside the newly formed academy. Now that we've established some of the intellectual context for Imanishi's revolutionary non-competitive theory of evolution, we ought to talk about his life and works. Most of what is known about his life comes from the biographical work done by Pamela Asquith, who is one of the translators of Seibutsu no Sekai, or The World of Living Things, into English. According to her, Imanishi Kinji was born the oldest son of a wealthy textile manufacturing family in the Nishijin area of Kyoto on January 6, 1902. Not much is known about his early life except that he enjoyed a certain amount of wealth and privilege that came along with being part of a textile manufacturing family of some status in Kyoto. For those that don't know, Kyoto is the long-standing historical center of textile and fabric manufacturing in Japan, and Kyoto silken textiles are very famous. It's said that, like many young children, he was interested in collecting insects and being outside, but his youth and indeed the rest of his life were marked by two passions in particular: natural history and mountain climbing. The study of the earth and the living things on it would be what he became most famous for and what he devoted his entire career to. And mountain climbing was a constant passion of his that was always a part of his career, as he believed that mountains were some of the few areas of Japan which had been untouched by urbanization and human interference. He was educated both in his undergraduate and doctoral studies at Kyoto Imperial University, and was awarded the Doctor of Science from there in 1940. He entered Kyoto Imperial University in 1924, and when he did, he chose to study entomology, or the study of insects. He later went on to study mayflies in the Kamo River, which runs through Kyoto, and he published many papers on their taxonomy and ecology between 1930 and 1940. During this time, he is thought of as having gained an interest in studying living nature and nature in process, as opposed to studying dead specimens and laboratory settings, which would heavily influence his future studies and writings. In addition to his studies of ecology, he also became a well-respected anthropologist, primatologist, and sociologist. His wide breadth of interests and academic foci was supported by his view of each of the fields which he pursued. According to Imanishi himself, quoted in his discussions with Pamela Asquith in the introduction to her translation of The World of Living Things, he was studying life and living things, and that meant everything from studying mayflies on Japan's rivers to studying human behavior and culture, all the way to studying Japan's primates. In 1932, when he was around 26 years old, he moved to the Shimogamo area of Kyoto so he could be closer to the river, in the interest of continuing to study the mayflies that lived in it. Around the time that he was completing his dissertation and was receiving his doctorate of science from Kyoto University in 1940, the Asia-Pacific War was starting to really ramp up, and he became very concerned that he would be drafted to fight for the Japanese Empire in the war. And so, fearing he would not survive this fight, he committed himself to penning down on paper his views about the nature of life, living things, and their constitution and relationship within the entire biosphere. This project, which he completed in a matter of months, was published in November of 1940. This work was The World of Living Things. After writing it, Imanishi was immediately indeed drafted for the war, and he was sent to Mongolia, which was comparatively safe as opposed to perhaps Manchuria or to the Pacific, where some of his collaborators and colleagues were sent to their deaths. Luckily for him, he survived the war, and he was repatriated to Japan at the end of it in 1945. I mentioned before that he's the father of Japanese primatology, and this is where that started. After the war, when he was repatriated, he began his studies of primatology, working closely with some of the Kyoto School collaborators that he knew during his time at Kyoto University. He remained prolific in publishing until the deterioration of his eyesight in the late 80s. Finally, when he passed away in 1992, his funeral service was attended by 1,500 people, including an envoy from the Japanese emperor himself. This ought to underscore how culturally important and well-liked he was during his life. He won several awards and accolades, he held several high-ranking academic positions at different universities, and he was an extremely well-read scholar during his academic career. His influence on Japanese culture and academia is completely immeasurable. As I've mentioned before, he is primarily known for proposing a theory of evolution that does not rely on natural selection by means of competition for resources. Indeed, thinking that Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection bore in it Western biases that played into capitalistic, individualistic, and imperialist ideologies that were incompatible with Japanese culture, Imanishi argued instead for a theory of nature that accounted for change in species over time that functioned based on intraspecific coexistence rather than competition, immaterial instead of material, and coextension with the environment rather than mere residence in it. This theorization was very popular among mid to late 20th century Japanese scholars and the public alike, and it still influences biology, ecology, and anthropology in Japan to this day. Now, we should come back to a more specific discussion of the world of living things because that constitutes the subject of this entire study. Imanishi Kinji described this book not as a scientific treatise, but instead as a self-portrait that lays out and explains his views of the entire world and all of its living inhabitants. These views, he says, serve as the wellspring for all of his future scientific writings. In the preface, he is apologetic for those moments in this relatively short book where he may appear unscholarly or even clumsy, but feels the need to nonetheless commit to paper how he approaches his study of the world. The book is organized into 5 chapters. According to Imanishi, the first 3 chapters are an introduction to chapter 4, which he believes is most central to the entire book. He felt the least confident about the points presented in those first 3 chapters, and the most confident about his positions in chapter 4. Finally, chapter 5 was intended to be an extension of his discussions of society, and thus merits more of his confidence than the first 3 chapters, but not as much as the 4th. These chapters are arranged such that they diagnose and appraise different levels of biological organization in such a way to pose a grand, internally consistent, unified theory of life from the level of the cellular to the level of society. Finally, this theory is examined for how it has unfolded over the course of history. Chapter 1 is called Similarity and Difference, or in Japanese, Soji to Soi. and it contains Imanishi's view about the very most fundamental nature of relationships among living things, be they cells, organisms, or societies. These relationships, he argues, revolve around the function of that organism and manifest as what we perceive to be as difference, which, he argues, comes from an inherent similarity that derives from a monistic reality. In other words, what we see as difference contains within it its own homogeneity, and that is because all difference is the result of differentiation of a singular and fundamentally homogeneous reality. In this chapter, you can see a very clear engagement with Nishida's own idea about how reality is a result of differentiation from some singular or pure nature or quality. Chapter 2 is called On Structure, or in Japanese, Kouzo ni tsuite. This is where Imanishi presents his understanding for the classification of living things according to their structure, which he understands has a necessary relationship with their function. In that, he proposes in great detail a number of axioms for how one may discriminate effectively between living and non-living things. These axioms rely on understanding living things as being constituted by an aggregation of cells, by a pattern of function, and by the coming together of structure, function, and spatio-temporal existence. This relationship between structure and function is one of the central axioms to 20th century biology in the West, and so you can see how that has strongly influenced his view of the world. Chapter 3 is called On Environment, or in Japanese, Kankyo ni tsuite. In this chapter, Imanishi applies the principle of the previous chapter, which was centered entirely on living things, to that of the abiotic environment. Not only does the environment exist in the same contexts and modalities that living things do, Imanishi argues, but it does so inseparably from living things, as it is precisely the abiotic molecules and compounds that chemically constitute living things. This means that living things are coextensive with their environment. Furthermore, living things are determinant over the structure and constitution of their environment. An environment to a degree also determines the structure and constitution of the living things it accommodates. To that end, it is folly to consider life as existing in any context removed from its environment. You'll remember that earlier we said that Imanishi sought to study nature in action and nature in motion, rather than study it in the laboratory or in some sort of dead collection of animals and organisms. Chapter 4 is called On Society, or Shakai ni tsuite, and it marks, in Imanishi's own words, the heart of the book. This chapter discusses in great detail how society arises out of the relationship between living and non-living things that was discussed in the first 3 chapters. First and foremost, although life can be thought of as being coextensive with the environment, it still must be understood that life is still more than the material, non-living components that constitute it. Life, in addition to the compounds, minerals, and molecules that make it up, is made up also of some sort of force or energy, known as a spirit or a soul. In Japanese, the term is seishin. This force can be thought of as the basis for the development of a society. Here we can see clear engagement with Nishida's own idea of the non-material component of life. However, this is not the same thing as seimei, or this life energy, which is the emergent and contextual organizational principle of this society. Imanishi argues that beings of a similar capacity or a similar content for living, as expressed by this spirit, aggregate together, and thus have structured and predictable mutual interactions which then determine their environment, including reproduction. Furthermore, their aggregation marks another coextensive stratum of organization. In other words, it is impossible in Imanishi's system to say that the cell and the organism are separate, that one comes before the other, or that one comes from the other. Indeed, just like a human being contains aggregates of cells, so too do nations contain aggregates of human beings. Nevertheless, the human being is not the same as the cell, nor is the nation the same as the human being. From this, society is continually born and developed and produced out of the minds and interactions of individual human beings. This has important implications about the observable variety in phenotype and the diversity of the biosphere that is discussed in more detail later. Chapter 5 is called On History, or in Japanese, Rekishi ni tsuite. In this chapter, Imanishi examines the world as a single structure composed of the elements presented in the previous chapters from the perspective of their temporal existence. In this, he provides his own commentary on the very nature of history. Also in this chapter, we can see his engagement with Jan Smuts and Smutsian holism. It will become clear from further analysis that he does not think of the world in holistic terms, but he borrows some of that viewpoint to inform his own. This chapter also has a presentation of one of Imanishi's most famous ideas, which is called the Species Society, or in Japanese, Shu Shakai. This is a society which is composed of numerous species, which are in turn composed of numerous individuals, who are in turn composed of an aggregation of cells, which are in turn composed of non-living components. In Imanishi's thinking, because of this relationship between the living and non-living components of the environment, living things are then coextensive with the environment. They're also in a determinate relationship with it. And finally, they exist in a spatial, temporal, structural, and functional modality within it. This makes up Imanishi's grand view of the entire world and every living thing, and it marks how he approached the study and observation of those things. Furthermore, my project argues that everything that we've discussed so far is the groundwork for, and even a prototype for, Imanishi's non-competitive theory of evolution, which he fleshes out in his future works after the writing of The World of Living Things in 1940. Previous scholarship has captured the legacy of the world of living things, and it's also captured the influences of all of these different thinkers that we've been talking about, such as Western philosophers and ecologists and Japanese philosophers in the world of living things. But it hasn't captured the ways in which the world of living things actually responds to that scholarship, and it also hasn't captured the ways in which this work represents a prototype or the foundation for his non-competitive theory of evolution, which goes off to have a life of its own in Japanese history, in Japanese biology, in Japanese anthropology, and Japanese sociology. The scholarship out there discusses that later life very well, but it doesn't really talk a lot about the conversation that the world of living things is specifically having with Jan Smuts, Nishida Kitaro, and others. My project contains a lot of in-depth textual analysis of Jan Smuts and Nishida Kitaro and the world of living things and others, and I won't get too far into that now, but I would like to say what I said earlier, which is that Imanishi was influenced by Smutsian holism, but was definitely not a holist. And with regards to Nishida, he was compelled by the discussion of seimei, or life force, or life energy, and thus commented on it himself in the world of living things, but he used it and defined it and understood it in a very different way from Nishida. The Japanese scholarship on the topic of the issue of Nishida and Imanishi's relationship intellectually commonly holds that Nishida and Imanishi came to reject both the mechanical and non-material theories of life. That is to say, they rejected hard materialism, but they also did not believe that the difference between a dead thing, like a rock, and a living thing, like a crab, was in its soul or its life force, which is snuffed out when it dies. In my project, I argue that this twofold rejection does not fully capture Imanishi's emphasis on the non-material component of life. Indeed, some Japanese scholars seem to regard Imanishi's acknowledgement of the conditionality, coextension, and contextuality within the environment of seimei as a rejection of a purely non-materialist perspective. Instead, I regard the world of living things not as a rejection of both material and non-material theories of life, but as a reimagination of the non-materialist perspective that accounts for the widely observable phenomenon that the material constitution and observable physiology of a living thing is in a coextensive and determinate relationship with its environment. Indeed, Imanishi's conception of seimei does not reject the material and immaterial views of life, but rather argues that seimei is an organizing principle of all nature that gives rise to the observable phenomena in it, including the environment, the organisms in it, and the societies in which they exist. In other words, he's arguing that this seimei, which we talked about before, is the organizational principle of the Shu Shakai, or the species society. It does not represent the seishin, or the individual soul or non-material component of the individual organism, as we discussed earlier. Instead, this is a force of nature which captures and moves and changes both living things and abiotic dead things. The nature of this seimei, Imanishi goes on to argue, is one that does not favor conflict. That is to say that organisms, in a relationship with each other, tend to avoid conflict because it is energy expensive, and it's not actually terribly productive to surviving up to reproductive age. In fact, organisms that engage in this competition over resources typically die whenever they do. Instead, Imanishi argues that this Shu Shakai, or the species society, unknowingly organizes itself in such a way that all the individuals in it live in some sort of harmony with each other, and the entire society lives in harmony and in coextension and in determination with its resource pool. That means that the society is able to produce food and adapt to changes in the environment, and also that the environment is being changed and being adapted to the needs of that society. and therefore change over time is a function not of the survival of the fittest, as is being interpreted from Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, but instead change over time is mediated by changing needs in that Shu Shakai's physiology, and it's also mediated by the changes in the environment that Shu Shakai or species society affects on its environment. From this, we may be thinking that the argument is that organisms evolve themselves over time. And that's not necessarily the case, because as I said before, these organisms do all of this unknowingly. In fact, one might interpret his writing to say that all of these organisms are acted upon by Seimei, rather than agents of Seimei. And to that end, their evolution is still not something that they hold within their grasp, but is actually something that guides and directs all of them, regardless of what they know, choose, or do, or think. This line of thinking about the possibility of free will within Imanishi's system is an avenue of research that has not been undertaken yet, and I highly recommend that someone ask and answer that question because it's a very interesting one, and I think that the research that it produces would be very, very fascinating. It's not something that I have done, but it's something that would be fantastic for somebody to do in the future. This concludes my master's thesis project about Imanishi Kinji and his seminal work, The World of Living Things. Now I'd like to offer some reflections about the project now that it's done and I've been awarded my master's degree, and hopefully these reflections will serve as advice or maybe as guidance for people who are writing a master's thesis of their own in a program that is academic rather than professional. This project was a big departure from my primary interests in Japanese Buddhism, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. My interests are specifically in pre-modern Japanese Buddhism, and to write and to study and to research in that field requires a very high language proficiency. That is to say that you must be able to read modern scholarly Japanese to be able to read the Japanese scholarship, and you also must be able to read and translate classical Japanese, and oftentimes also Kanbun, which is the Japanese version of classical Chinese. That's because all of the texts that you would read, the primary source materials that you would get from that time period before the modernization of the Japanese language, would be written in this classical Japanese or in Kanbun. I can read modern Japanese and was able to do so for this thesis. The primary source material, The World of Living Things, was published in 1940, which is very close to when the Japanese government began to standardize the Japanese language, so it was hard but not too hard for me. Additionally, I was able to read the Japanese scholarship about Seimei and about Imanishi Kinji and Nishida Kitaro, and all of the philosophy and the debate that went on between them. However, at the time when I needed to begin writing this project and began choosing this project, I could not yet read classical Japanese. In fact, I took classical Japanese classes while I was writing this paper and completing this project. So, that being the case, I simply was not able to access any sources from before the modern era. If I had committed myself to doing so, I would have essentially committed myself to an extra long master's degree program, which I didn't want to do. So instead what I did was I compromised on a project that was within my language ability and was interesting enough to me to keep me happy for the academic year that it would take to complete it. So my advice then, with regards to projects like this, is to stick within your own language ability, or else you're going to have to learn the language on the fly while you're doing the project, and that's never good. And also, be flexible with regard to what project you do when. That is to say, even though this is not the project I want to write a dissertation on and build a career on, this is a project that I was just happy enough with to write on and work on for one academic year, or about 12 months, so that I could finish my thesis and finish my master's degree and move on to bigger and better things. The fact that this project is not within the realm of my primary interest does not represent a black mark on my career. It just means that now I have a lot of writing and research experience in a part of the field that is not my specialty. Having more writing and research experience and having more specialized knowledge in different parts of your own field is never ever a bad thing. Finally, I don't think that the project actually turned out all that bad. I was very happy with the contribution I made to the discussion of what was going on in Japan in the early 20th century with regards to the theory of evolution, the history of science, the history of Japanese Buddhism and Japanese Shinto, and so on and so forth. While I don't think that it was super high impact, and I don't think that it represents a landmark in the field of early 20th century Japanese history, I do think that it represents a contribution to the field that I can be proud of, especially since it's my first long-form study on anything. As for advice about how to complete a master's thesis project while you're also taking graduate level classes and working on everything else that you have going on in your life, I do have some basic advice that might help as you're trying to traverse that path. The biggest piece of advice I can give is to write and read every single day. You should start writing from the very start of your research, and you shouldn't stop until the end. That means that, of course, most of what you write will not end up in the final product, but it does mean that you'll be writing and researching and learning and polishing your writing all at the same time. And so your writing will only get better and more informed the further you go. So for a 72-page thesis, which is the length of my thesis, you'll probably end up writing around twice that, or 140 pages, if you're lucky, during the course of the 2 semesters that you're working on the project. That's not a bad thing. You can always keep all of that writing and always have it to go back to if you ever write on the same topic again, and that's not a bad thing. You just should not approach this the same way that you might approach an undergraduate paper or even a graduate seminar paper that's of shorter length, like 20 pages, for example. Furthermore, if you write a little bit every day, then the task of writing 75 pages for a thesis becomes less and less daunting. And before you know it, you'll actually have close to that much that you can start to edit and revise and polish before your thesis deadline comes up. I remember that I wrote the bulk of my paper in the course of about 3 to 4 weeks leading up to my deadline when it came up in the spring semester. The way that I did this was I wrote for about an hour or 2 every single day, in addition to all of my other classes and in addition to the podcast and other stuff. And that meant that I was making huge progress every single day. And I'd never had to feel like I had a 75-page paper assignment sitting on my desk at any one time. Instead, I was chipping away at individual pieces or chapters of it without having to think about the thing as a whole. Then, at the very end, I was able to summarize my arguments and to reflect on what they broadly meant for my contribution to the field, and then rewrite the thesis statement for the entire thing. Furthermore, that model allowed me to do something else, which is another piece of advice I have, and that is to follow your questions. I was able to follow my questions about the text and about what it meant and about how it engaged with the theory of evolution and with these other Western scholars and with Nishida Kitaro because I was just simply reading and writing all the time. That way, I didn't feel like I was completing a paper assignment for a class. I felt like I was becoming an expert in the topic, and then the writing was secondary to my expertise in the topic. That's all the advice I have for any of you who are out there writing a master's thesis for a humanities-driven academic program. And I hope that you've enjoyed this research project, and I hope that the advice is useful to you, and I hope that you'll tune in next time for our next research project episode. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or tweet us at brightbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.